Hello everyone, you can call me Freebiewitz, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Analyse and Adapt, where I take a look at some of my favorite video games and see if they could work in 3 different mediums. Tabletop board games or card games, tabletop roleplay, and finally, as a LARP. Today we're taking a look at the Borderlands 2 game. So, quick bit of history. I remember playing the original Borderlands on a computer at an internet cafe, and up until then, I hadn't really experienced many cooperative shooters, never mind an RPG. Let me just say, I was hooked. As soon as I could, I got it for my Xbox 360 and played split screen with my sister before forgetting about it as soon as the second game was released. Then getting it on PC once my PC got upgraded. I remember how everything seemed shinier and better than the original, and how amazing and distinct each weapon was, and of course how sad I was by Claptrap's mistreatment. Seriously, I like that robot. Borderlands the pre-sequel was cool, but it never really clicked for me despite being an Aussie myself, though I did love the Telltale adaptation of Borderlands and their use of multiple points of view. Then you had Borderlands 3, which I also enjoyed, even if I disagreed on how some story elements went. But at the end of the day, I found myself preferring the second game. Now don't get me wrong, I still like Borderlands 3, but Handsome Jack was a fantastic villain, and the plot of Borderlands 2 was going to be hard to top no matter what they did. That and the controversy surrounding the CEO at the time. But I'm not here to tell you about the Borderlands franchise. I'm here to analyze and adapt the second Borderlands game, starting with Tabletop. The Borderlands games for me is a game about working together, shooting stuff, and then looting their corpses alongside any nearby treasure chests, lockers, and toilet seats. If you think that's unhygienic, then I won't mention the literal excrement you dig through for loot. Borderlands 2 is convenient as a board game in the fact that it gives us an end goal to work with, an end goal that's remained the same regardless of the game. To find, hunt down, and loot the mythical vault. To that end, I'd suggest something similar to Bionicle, Quest for Makuta board game. In that game, players take turns laying out tiles, which would make up the board. Judging by the review scores, this game wasn't well received, but when I was a kid, I was blown away by the fact that the playing board was modular as it was. Anyways, we don't have to implement the modular map part of the game into Borderlands 2, just the victory condition. To win in Borderlands, you had to find a bunch of keys that are scattered around the map, bring them together, and defeat the final boss, something I feel transfers over to Borderlands very well with the key vault fragments. In terms of combat, it would be limited to 4 players with different stats. To keep it simplified, we're just focusing on the spirit of each character. Axton is a versatile soldier with a turret. Maya is a powerful siren who can lock down enemies. Zero is a crazy mobile assassin who, as his profession suggests, assassinates people. And Salvador is a dwarf that holds 2 guns and likes to shoot things a lot. Also, he's very enthusiastic. As much as I love the DLC characters, I'm going to focus on the base 4 for now to make things easier on myself. Victory in combat will be determined by who has the biggest numbers with dice. Depending on the weapons, each player would gain an extra dice whenever using a weapon they specialize in. The reason why we're giving extra dice instead of flat out numbered bonuses is because I like the idea of rolling more dice in general. To me, it's more satisfying than doing any extra maths in your head. Sure, you have to do more maths anyways, but now you get to satisfy the lizard part of your brain that likes picking things up and dropping them all at the same time. Or maybe that's just me. Oh yeah, that's the stuff. Anyways, for weapon specializations, there would be some crossovers, but generally each player would be able to share the guns without stepping on each other's toes too much. Axton would use rifles, Mayo would use SMGs or elemental weapons, Zero with sniper rifles, and Salvador would probably have anything that shoots fast, I guess. Look, what they actually specialize in would probably come down to how they level up their characters. Besides Bionicle, another game we could draw inspiration from is Talisman. The main tweak I'd do to make it more cooperative in nature and to get to the vault, the players as a group would have to find all the pieces. Of the key, that is. Now, due to how respawning works in Borderlands, we just removed some wealth rather than taking away everything like in Talisman. All these proposed tweaks, however, does bring up an interesting point, however, and that is lose conditions. Technically speaking, you can't really lose Borderlands as a whole. Sure, you can lose individual missions or die, but you just get back up and try again, and with enough grinding, gear, and perseverance, anyone could in theory finish the game at least once. To that end, I suggest using money as the final score, injecting some level of competitive play and decision making into the game if they so wish it. The final boss upon death would give a multiplier based on who is still alive and who actually fought it. Players who are close enough can arrive to the battle sooner, but those who are far away might struggle to get to the final cash reward. As they say, I got bills to pay, I got mouths to feed, there ain't nothing in this world for free. Because of this, guns and equipment would also cost money, which of course they already do in the video game. You could save up what are essentially your victory points, but doing that would stifle your combat ability. You could spend it all on the best guns, but if you do that and the endgame comes around with an empty wallet, you're not gonna win. After all, 0 times 100 is still 0. So, for the players, a balance would need to be struck, where the risk is the reward. So as fun as this adaptation might be, I'm under the impression that I've failed to adapt it properly. Don't get me wrong, I think I've captured the spirit of cooperative competitive play, but at the end of the day, one of the biggest features in Borderlands isn't your friends, it isn't the money, but rather the guns. To that end, guns would of course be cards, each one with stats denoting their damage and gun types. If we really wanted to have some crazy gun modifications, instead of having one card per gun, we could have one card for every part of the gun. When you loot a gun, you pull from the barrel deck, the handle deck, and the sights deck, etc. You do this until you create the whole gun, made up of a hodgepodge of different parts. Each part type would be divided up into its own individual decks, so you wouldn't have a shotgun rifle attached to a pistol. It's a bit cumbersome as far as equipment goes, but I think it works with the spirit of the game. Something that can be carried into the next type of medium. There are many kinds of players out there who love to focus on different aspects of the role-playing hobby. Some enjoy the social aspects, others prefer the combat, and others the puzzle elements. Borderlands can certainly accommodate those tastes with differing levels of ease, but in my mind, this game, if adapted to tabletop RPGs, would fill a very predictable yet specific niche. Loot. There's just something about amassing wealth and possessions in tabletop role-playing games that really clicks for me sometimes. Or maybe it's just when I play rogues. In my mind, a Borderlands-style game would not be complete without guns that do weird things. To that end, the randomized card system I mentioned before would be perfect, to a certain degree. In practice, having a set of cards bundled in a certain way between sessions would be very impractical. Besides the danger of character sheets, dice, and other tabletop equipment getting lost, I could easily see the bundled cards getting mixed up somewhere along the lines. That is, unless you make some sort of card-holding piece of plastic, arranged to look like a gun, I guess, but then you'd have to have multiple card holders for all the guns. Now that I think about it and say it out loud, they could probably just be stored in normal card-holding binders. If it works for magic cards, it probably could work for this. I mean, we could just write everything down, but it'd be tedious. What do I mean by that? Well, in the Borderlands video games, you can be expected to go through dozens of guns in a single session, if not more. Now, imagine, as the game master for the tabletop version, rolling up the stats for each and every single weapon. Imagine being the player who has to then write them down in their inventory, only to sell most of them off. Even if you're a fast writer, you might end up using the eraser so much that you'd rub a hole through your sheet by the end of the game. The obvious solution to me is to use a computer to type things up, but any GM who's had players bring in laptops will tell you that they lead to very distracted players by the end of it. In that regard, when distributing loot, you'd have to keep things abstract and vague. For example, you could say something along the lines of, "You have a pile of loot. Most of it is junk that you can sell for $200, but among the terrible guns you find a decent sniper rifle with these stats." As I mentioned previously, this can easily be solved by just having cards, so players would have something physical in front of them instead of having to write it down all the time. Moving on from loot, when it comes to classes, it seems pretty straightforward to me. You can be someone who throws down a turret, someone who summons a singularity, become invisible, or hold two guns at the same time. The specific party roles can be customized as the player sees fit, becoming a support character, tougher or more damaging as their playstyle prefers. One of the biggest criticisms of Borderlands 2 in terms of level up mechanics is the fact that leveling up is just a straight stat increase with only a few level up options that drastically change how the character plays and behaves. However, I don't feel like that would be too much of a downside in tabletop RPG. There are plenty of games where players are given a character with few skills and instead of learning more, simply get better at what they already know. Unlike the video game where your basic actions are limited to jump, duck, and shoot, in a tabletop game I can bluff, set up traps, create distractions, and use the environment to my advantage. Sure, there are exploding barrels in the video game, but you can't blast open a wall and run through it for cover or shoot a bridge to make it collapse outside of scripted events, that is. To that end, the player will likely care less about the mechanical limitations and begin asking, what else can I do? Another thing I'd like to suggest is that players play as the pre-made characters of Axton, Maya, Zero, and Salvador. Playing pre-made characters, while less common these days, isn't unheard of, and earlier role-playing games often task players to do just that, to play another role as it were. It might run into the issue where some players' interpretations of the character doesn't gel with someone else's interpretation, but as long as we make it clear that it's just a specific player's interpretation of said canon characters, I'm sure we'll be fine. After all, if you're playing in a group, you're probably hanging out with people you call friends, or at least strangers who you want to be friends with. If you're not friends, or don't intend to become friends, then why are you playing together in the first place? In all seriousness, having pre-made characters means less work for the GM in terms of creating backstories or adding elements to gel with them in the first place. In fact, that's something that doesn't get brought up much in Borderlands 2, the characters' individual histories, that is. Sure, you get the echo recordings, but you can't really visit Salvador's old home. Maya never gets targeted to be kidnapped to power the keys, and Axton doesn't really do anything in Lynchwood differently despite being there before. Zero having no connection with anything, however, fits perfectly well. With that all said and done, let's see if we can make this a LARP. Gun-based LARPs or blaster-like hobbies already exist in a myriad of different ways, but they all more or less have similar rules in that they have safety standards on when and how you can shoot each other, along with the appropriate facial protections. Nerf guns and laser tag, while less dangerous, generally also have safety guidelines, things like no diving or jumping and the like. For me, it's difficult to decide which kind of blaster to use for a Borderlands 2 style game. If this was a realistic style game, where one shot could easily take someone out, I'd suggest the more dangerous blasters that require facial protections. If the game required a melee combatant in which certain players are encouraged to get into each other's faces like Jedis in Star Wars, I'd choose the softer blasters. Based on that, you'd think I'd go with Nerf weapons or laser tag to represent Borderlands. After all, many characters have melee attacks or even melee class-based upgrades, and would thus need to get in close without fear of losing an eye to a paintball. However, if we do that, then long-range characters who specialize in sniper rifles would suffer. Nerf guns and laser tag, for example, don't lend themselves to sniping, and even airsoft has issues with it. While I've never experienced it myself, I've heard and read that snipers in that hobby complain about people not calling out hits when hit by sniper rounds, while the person who got hit would say they never felt it, since the pellet would lose so much momentum by the time it reaches them. Based on that alone, it's probably just easier to make this a Nerf or laser tag game. I know that Zero can easily be played as a close-range character with his sword and everything, but I want to still try to adapt as much as the game as I can, including the long-range combat aspects of it as well. So how do we ensure that we have super tough characters like Salvador run around while having sniper rifles still hurt from a distance? The answer is actually pretty simple, at least on paper. All we need to do is make it a mixed blaster setting. Now, it's not the most practical idea, and I'm sure I'm overlooking some logistical nightmare somewhere, but having short-range Nerf guns blast away at any distance compared to the high-powered, long-range sniper paintball gun might just work. The fact that paintballs and the like actually hurt would make keeping track of what you're being hit by easier. Normal darts from a pistol or rifle might deal a single point of damage, while a shot from a sniper rifle would do more, for example. With that mechanic sorted, at least on the surface level, let's try to look at the other aspects of Borderlands 2. Assuming we're not paying too much attention to canon, we can have 3 Salvadors running around in the video game, punching and screaming at everything. With that idea in place, it means we can have multiple people double up as characters in LARP. The question now becomes, what do we do with class-specific abilities? Well, Zero can turn invisible and leave behind a decoy. Awkward to implement, but I've LARPed against invisible characters before, so the idea isn't without precedent. Maya would just stop people from moving, and Salvador could carry around 2 guns, which, while awkward depending on the weapons you decide to dual wield, it can still physically be done. What concerns me, however, is Axton's turret. Now we can probably get a camera tripod, mount a Nerf blaster on it, and maybe give it some sort of motion sensor and the like, but that probably wouldn't work. Even if you construct it, you'd also have to program it not to shoot its owner or any ally. We could make it remote controlled, I suppose, but that'd mean you'd have to have someone sitting off field waiting for you to deploy it, and that just seems like a waste of time for said player who's waiting off to the side. You could also make it controlled directly by Axton themselves, or have it shoot in one direction until it runs out of ammo, but at that point it's not really mechanically Axton anymore. Then you have loot as a mechanic. I've mentioned this before in previous videos, but it's my view that you shouldn't force your players to constantly buy new equipment for each session, and if the person running it is providing the equipment, then the price of entry for players would increase as a result. Alternatively, you could give players special ribbons or cheaper attachments to put on their guns. These additions could represent more damage or damage types, but once again, this wouldn't help much. Players getting shot in the back, for example, while running away, are unlikely to turn back to see what color gun they're being hit by in the heat of combat. Your +7 Jacobs hand cannon would feel the same as being hit by a discount TDO pistol in a Larp setting, especially if they both use Nerf darts. In other words, Borderlands 2 as a Larp wouldn't be really Borderlands 2 at all, at least in a practical way. If we do adapt the game into Larp, we'd have to stick to a pre-approved list of weapons and abilities to even make it work. So beyond the aesthetics and such, we can't really do it at all. So that's my analysis of Borderlands 2 and how it can be adapted into 3 different mediums. How do you think it'd work? Have any of you tried adapting any elements of the game yourself, and if so, how did it go? Comment, like, and subscribe, and maybe, just maybe, we'll come back to the subject sometime in the future. My name is Freebiewitz, and thank you for watching.